Okay, so this is the Bible study for Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. So we're just taking a short text this time because there's a lot of things that I could kind of combine together, but this I think has a very important thought for us, and I didn't want it to become sort of secondary. So we're just taking these 5 verses. And the text for today says, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. So remember, you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. Number one on our Bible study says, what did we talk about in the last Bible study in 17:22 through 27? Jesus talked about being delivered into the hands of men who would kill him, and on the third day he would be raised to life. That's true, and that was kind of a short section that I included 2 sections together. And we didn't talk about that a lot. Peter defends Jesus from those who questioned whether he would pay the temple tax. That's true. They asked Peter, and he said, yeah, he does. Sure, he does. Why wouldn't he? And then as soon as he walked in the house, Jesus spoke. Uh, Peter talked without thinking or understanding what was really going on with Jesus. So Jesus was trying to educate Peter on who who he was and how he did things, but Peter's always thinking from a worldly perspective. He's coming into it from a very different angle, just like everybody else was, honestly, when it came to Jesus. And unless we kind of beat up Peter, everybody was thinking this way, and Peter uh, just happened to be the one that spoke really quickly, and he wasn't really good at this slow to speak and quick to listen part. Um, and he wasn't attacking Jesus like so many of the teachers of the law and like those people that he was felt the need to defend Jesus from, but at the same time, he was speaking without fully understanding. So Jesus correct Peter, tried to teach him, and then provided for the tax in order to not cause offense. So this is not. He should be exempt, but that's not a big deal. We're not going to make everybody mad. We're going to go ahead and get this paid. It's another miracle that's shown, and Peter is it sort of reaffirms to Peter that everybody's worrying about the wrong thing. Like whether I pay this or not doesn't matter either way. The fact that they're worried about it shows they don't understand. The fact that you feel like you need to defend me shows that you don't understand. But it's not worth making a big deal about. Go fishing, and you'll find a fish. The first fish you catch will have the coins in its mouth that we need to pay the. So I can provide for all this. No big deal. Uh, Number two, what happens now according to 18:1? At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So it doesn't seem like um, that's something that was a conversation that Jesus was interested in having. It seems like this is another way that the disciples didn't seem to understand what the kingdom of heaven is all about and what Jesus is trying to do. But this is something that they're very interested in. This is something that they discuss. And I think in other gospels we see them in other passages we see them sort of arguing about it, and Jesus encounters them. And in this passage, it shows, they actually came to him and asked, okay, so who is the greatest? So number 3 says, how did Jesus respond according to 18:2 through 5? A, he called a little child to him and placed him among them. Placed the child among them. So that's true. B, he said, truly I tell you, unless you change. I felt like I needed to stop there. Obviously, Jesus didn't stop there, and we'll talk about the change specifically that he was talking about. But I think we need to point out that Jesus told his disciples that they needed to change, because if they didn't change, they wouldn't enter the kingdom of heaven. They're worried about who's going to be the greatest. And he says, unless you change, you're not even going to be there. What do you care? Um, so, then C says, unless you change and become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying you need to become like little children. Okay, then because otherwise you're not even going to be in. Forget least and greatest. You're not even going to be in unless you change and become like a little child. D, Jesus said, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Yes. So that's the word that he used in verse 4. And then E, he said, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. So I got a lot to say about that, but actually we're going to talk about it in number 4. So number 4 says, so who is the greatest? So like what was the answer? A, children. Wait, aren't children selfish and competitive for attention by nature? It sounds like they should not become children. It seems like they should not be children. So I think in our common language today, we would say become childlike, not childish, because childish is a level of immaturity, and so there's a certain aspect of children that Jesus wants them to model themselves after. But probably not, that probably is not the aspect where they're fighting over toys, where they're trying to get mom's attention, and that sort of thing. So, um, oh boy. Um, it is not okay. Some good parenting advice. Um, Give your children appropriate attention at the right times, because if you do not, they will seek attention at the wrong times. So I've seen children and even teenagers who have not received proper attention as children, and felt valued and whatever, and they have this tendency to interrupt. Like if you're having an adult conversation, adult to adult, they jump into the middle of it. And so we got situations. I watch it where we're having an adult conversation, and now children. It's not just children. Children are like mom, 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 or whatever. But then teenagers, now they have these phones, and they're like, hey, watch this video, watch this thing, do this thing. Hey, hey, pay attention to me. And you're like, hey, what what's going on here? Why do you need attention right now? Um, and I think sort of psychologically, part of that is when they have not received proper attention at the proper times. So I say all this because it kind of requires proper balance, because children, I believe, should not be constantly interrupting adult conversations. If they are, the chances are you don't allow. I think there's a lot of families that probably sit and watch TV and they don't want their kids to interrupt when they're watching TV. And basically, they don't ever give their kids attention. So their kids are constantly trying to get attention, whether it's during their while they're watching TV or while they're in public areas with other people talking. And so I would say, so for me, when my kids come in, particularly like when they get home, now my oldest son drives. When they get home from practice, if we're watching TV, I pause the TV. Um, because I don't want them to go straight to their room. I would rather they talk to me about their day. A lot of families historically have sat around the dinner table and had no phones or no TV or whatever sitting around the dinner table. Sometimes our schedule does not allow for us all to eat dinner at the same time. Sometimes our schedule does not allow for all that to happen. But I will tell you that when my kids get home, I almost always pause the TV, set down the phone, and take time to pay attention to them. Um, I say all this because what we need to understand about the context of this, of what Jesus is doing, is that the children were outside the circle. And let me just say the children were probably well trained that they were supposed to remain outside the circle. So he had to call the child over. So the child was playing with the other children, probably outside the circle of adult conversation. Um, so because our children in general are so unhealthy, they're not they're starved for attention. They're not well disciplined in general. Um, One of the things that I've noticed is we have an argument over this and we say, see, Jesus brought the child into the middle of the circle. So it's normal for children to interrupt adult conversations and we should sort of welcome them. That's what Jesus is saying. Now, first of all, Jesus is using an example, um, which is not really about children. He's not really teaching about children. The child is the example. And the thing that is the example about the child is that the child is understood to be not important in the context of sort of this adult conversation that they're having. So, for us to take this out of context and then say, well, see, what Jesus means is that children shouldn't be sent to their room or they shouldn't be put aside. You shouldn't ignore a child well, first of all, I don't think you should ignore a child when they're interrupting an adult conversation. I think you ought to correct a child that is interrupting an adult conversation. And but I said what I said before because if you are correcting a child for interrupting an adult conversation, but the reason they're interrupting is because you have not given your children proper attention at the times that is appropriate for you to give them attention, then you're correcting a child who is starved for attention because you have starved them. So don't do that. Um, and honestly, sometimes we, whether it's foster care or whatever, sometimes we are caring, and in our church ministries, sometimes we are caring for kids that somebody else has starved for attention, and sometimes it's healthy to give them, make sure we set up times to give them proper attention. So I'm saying, and I'm not a child psychologist, but I'll tell you this. Um, in the context of our church, we have a lot of children who are starved for attention for various reasons. Many times because their parents do not know how to properly parent them, or they're in a on a foster care or adoption context because before they were not cared for and given proper attention because mom was on drugs or whatever else. Mom and dad were doing things that consumed them that were more important to them than caring for their children. So we really need to understand that. Um, so I've kind of gotten used to having adult conversations with children walking up and sort of interrupting in our church and in actually in my friend circles in a lot of cases since it's a lot of folks from our church. Um, so much so that um, so we had a couple over who were part of our church years ago and went out in ministry, and they have kids the age of our kids, and we had them over for dinner. They were in from out of town. Our kids went to play. They went to the room, they went out to jump on the trampoline, whatever, they went to play. This was when our kids were a little younger. And we were there for 3 hours having catching up and eating dinner and whatever, and our kids and their kids, none of them ever came and interrupted the adult conversation. And Cynthia and I afterwards said, wow, that was so different. And it was so different because um, I believe we've given our kids proper attention, and um, our friends had given their kids proper attention so they could be independent and play together without interrupting our conversation at the times they knew was inappropriate. Whereas a lot of kids that we work with do not. Now, I say all that because I think that we have to understand that this is, first of all, not telling us it's okay for kids to interrupt adult conversations. That's not what Jesus is saying here. What he is saying is he's in a situation where the kids understood that they were not to interrupt. Therefore, they were playing happily outside of the circle. And that was the social context in which, so I would say this is more like a conversation that we were having with our friends where the kids were not anywhere close to us, not interrupting, not bothering us, but playing on their own. And then Jesus, in that context where everybody understood that was appropriate, he then called a child in and picked them up and put them in the middle of the circle, which would have, and I'm not saying that it wasn't like they were all in a, like, this is sort of not literal, that they were like circled up holding hands singing kumbaya, but there was, there were probably people sitting and standing at different levels, but they were in this conversation, and the circle was sort of closed, and Jesus picked up this child that was so engaged in playing that he had to call him over, and then he set him in the middle, and that's the context into which in which we hear this teaching. So B, Jesus had to call the child and put the child among them. The child was so shouldn't be slowly. The child was so lowly that they were not included in the circle. That is the thing about children that he was trying to present. He is saying, unless you become like the person that is not important enough to be in the circle. So what they're arguing, okay, once we're in the circle, who's the most important person in the circle? And Jesus says, the most important person in the circle is the person that's not in the circle. Let me just tell you, and I know this is working ahead a little bit, but after the next text in verses 6 through 9, we have the parable of the wandering sheep. Okay, so Jesus is already beginning to look forward to that parable as he's saying this. So the most important person in our circle is the person not in our circle. So we used to say that in our church a lot. We'd say the most important, if you're here for the first time, you are the most important person here besides Jesus. The most important person in our church is the person that's not yet in our church. That's what Jesus is saying. So that's the thing about children that Jesus was trying to present. So that's why I talked a lot. I talked a lot about probably sort of maybe human wisdom or my own wisdom. I feel like it's of God, but I'm not like citing or quoting a text to say this is how it should be. Children shouldn't interrupt adult conversations. But I am telling you, I talked all about that to present the context in which Jesus was teaching this. So to understand Jesus as saying it should be normal for children to interrupt adult conversations, that's how we ought to behave. That's what Jesus was teaching. That would not be appropriate because what Jesus was saying, the whole reason that he was using the child as the example is because the child was understood to be someone who is outside of the circle. So I think the greatest in the kingdom is the person that doesn't care about being the greatest. So he's saying, first of all, the greatest is the person who's not yet in here. Second of all, if you want to worry about who's the greatest, then you better be the person that would welcome the person who's not yet in here. And in order to welcome the person who's not yet in here, you might lose standing within the group. So you need to not care about who's the greatest, but instead care about who's not in the circle. Um, I'll give you an example. Pastor Bain years ago used this example, and he shared it publicly, so I don't think I'm betraying anything. But he was showing a denominational dignitary. I think it was the president of the Bible College, or a district superintendent, or a visiting general superintendent, or somebody like that, was in town, and he was showing them our ministries, and he was showing them the church that we were still in the process of moving to there on Central. We were in the middle of remodeling it, I believe, and as he was showing it to them, some homeless folks walked up and said, hey pastor," and Pastor Bain admitted that his first thought was, "Oh, what are they going to say? What are they going to do? This is going to be embarrassing. I've got this important person here." The first, because that is our human nature. In order for me to have standing with a dignitary, I have to show that I have other friends who are dignitaries. Like that's sort of the social system of this world, right? Do we understand that? The social system of this world is that the more important people you have around you, the more you look worthy of a visit from another important person. And so, what you really want to do in this world context is gather important people, or so people drop names and they say, I hang out with this person and this person and this person because that raises their status. But Jesus hung out with tax collectors and sinners. Jesus hung out with people that were outside the circle, and his disciples watched him do that, but at the same time, there was something in them that liked hanging around Jesus because when you hung around Jesus, he's a pretty important person. So their thought is, so when we gather all these important people around us, who is the most important of the important people? And Jesus said, the person that's not there is the most important. And if you care about gathering around you these important people and you don't welcome that person that's not there, then not only will you be least in the kingdom, you're not going to enter the kingdom. So D, also Jesus points out that we should welcome the person that is outside the circle, which is not common among people who want to be the most important person in the circle. People don't do that because as soon as you welcome the person outside the circle, people are like, "Oh, you're hanging out with them? Maybe you are not fancy enough to hang out with us." And I know, like, so our country, our world has sort of lost this. I don't know. Perhaps there's a distance between us and the upper class, and so we don't like to. I think generally middle class, upper middle class, even lower class, in terms of income and social standing, we don't even like, it's almost become like we look down on the fancy people in our country and in our world. I think Bernie Sanders had a great appeal to a lot of people because of that, because of the way he ironically, pointed out the 1%, and people were like, nah, we don't want to, yeah, we don't like those people. They shouldn't, we need to get them to pay the way. And anyway, um, but what Jesus said is you should hang out with the lower class. You should hang out with the people that nobody else includes. And so when our church um, brings somebody to a district event that just doesn't match, it just doesn't look like the other people, I'm pumped because I'm like, we have just invited somebody into the circle that was not a part of the circle before. I get pumped when we sit down and we have people of all cultures, of all races and national backgrounds. I get pumped when we have people that don't know how to behave in church and we bring them to district assembly with us. I get pumped because I feel like that's what Jesus did. Because I get uncomfortable, honestly, at a district or denominational gathering where we're all glad handing and patting each other on the back and happy that we're the people in the circle that I get uncomfortable. Like I get uncomfortable when my wife sort of laughed because John Maxwell is a great writer and speaker about leadership and an amazing man. And honestly, the humility that he spoke with at the mission conference was amazing. But my wife laughed because she had never read a book of his and she didn't know who he was, but she laughed at how the pastors and leaders not in our church but in the Church of the Nazarene were acting around him because they were like giddy and they were like, he was like a king just showed up, and she didn't know who he was, but she was like, they're acting crazy, what in the world is going on? And she wasn't wrong. It was true. People were embarrassing themselves, acting crazy because this dignitary, now God has used him in so many ways, and it's not about that, but it's just about how people were acting. It was just kind of crazy. um, because honestly, if I brought a homeless person in, they would not act that way around that person. And that's what our church is supposed to be. That's what Jesus is saying. We should be the person, the group that if we don't welcome somebody in who's outside the circle, we don't even deserve to be in the circle. And that is not the culture of our world. And honestly, it's really not the culture of our of the church in America. And that's something we need to deal with. And that's why I didn't want to go on to the next text, because I want us to just process that. So number 5 says, what about you? How do you measure up to the answer Jesus gave? In other words, how likely are you to bring somebody in from outside of the circle versus how likely are you to feel really good about being in the circle and trying to raise your status in the circle. I want you to think about that and I want you to consider it because Jesus said, if you wouldn't welcome somebody in, then you don't deserve to be in. And that's the message he gave to them who were trying to decide who was the greatest. Is you're great if you don't care you're great and you're more willing to welcome somebody in.